Thank you so much for joining us this evening for a very, very special Fall Author Series event. I would like to thank you, first of all, for your continued support of our annual Friends of the Library campaign. Your contributions to the campaign allow us to provide programs like these, and I want to thank you so much for your generosity and encourage you to continue to donate. I also want to extend a huge thank you to Rosanna at Barrett Bookstore for arranging for our guest's appearance tonight, and with such perfect timing, because we will all now have wonderful new and delicious ideas to add to our Thanksgiving menus. Lastly, I want to thank the amazing and incredible Darien Library staff members who baked the recipes from the cookbook tonight for us all to enjoy. I hope you stay after the presentation to enjoy the refreshments, which are all taken directly from the book. So, there's a brilliant quote by author George Bernard Shaw that says, "There is no sincerer love than the love of food." Now, some of us may be thinking, well, what about the love of family? But I know I'm not alone in admitting that there are definitely times that I am willing to forego all decency and wrestle my sisters or my brother-in-law to the ground for that last piece of my mom's brownies. We are all guilty of that, but it's okay, because our sincerest love of food makes it all the more exciting to indulge in wonderful recipes, amazing recipes, and talk about them with our family and friends, and most especially have the chance to turn this love into a storied and award-winning career as a chef and food writer, as our guest speaker for tonight has done. And she has shared her knowledge, expertise, and love of food with all of us in a slew of gorgeous cookbooks, including the James Beard Award-winning Baking from My Home to Yours and Baking with Julia. Her latest, Around My French Table, More Than 300 Recipes from My Home to Yours, was just published a few weeks ago, and already it's a New York Times bestseller, and Amazon has picked it as its #1 cookbook for 2010. Amazing. In this book, yes, it is, and the food is amazing too. In this book, our guest draws on her years of experiences visiting and living in France to offer new renditions on classical French dishes, as well as brand new and completely unexpected recipes. With each recipe, our author tells the stories behind the food and guides you through the cooking process as though she's standing right there with you in the kitchen. It's comfort food with a comforting helping hand, and really, what could be better? In addition to all of her cookbook accomplishments, our guest tonight has been a food writer and recipe tester for Elle magazine, and is also a contributing editor for Parade, a longtime special correspondent for Bon Appetit, and a frequent guest on NPR. She also runs 2 very popular cookbook-inspired blogs, Tuesdays with Dory and French Fridays with Dory. And while we couldn't be more excited that the long-anticipated Thursday evening with Dory has finally arrived here at Darien Library, and so won't you please join me in welcoming our guest speaker for this evening, author and chef Dorie Greenspan.
That was really, really sweet. Thank you. Wait until you see what everyone has baked. Thank you so much for baking. But I think normally, before I finish, I describe my cookbook, but I think I'll just tell you all about what everybody has done. I was so touched by it. First of all, thank you all so much for coming, and thank you for the bakers and the warm welcome. Around My French Table is my 10th cookbook. And most of my cookbooks have been about baking. I mean, so it was Baking with Julia Child, and I worked with Pierre Hermé, who's the most fabulous pastry chef in France, and I think that means he's the most fabulous pastry chef in the world, because, right, you get it. And my own baking books. This is the first book that I've done that's a whole meal that starts with nibbles to have with drinks and goes through dessert and has lots of, it's kind of my salty side. And I think of this book as proof that in the 30 years that I was feeding my little family brownies and cookies and tarts and cakes, is that me? It is? if I stand over here, what? Oh, I don't mind you. You're cute. Okay, will I stop popping? Okay, so, but I'm not going to come so close. In all the years that I was feeding them sweets, I was really a responsible mother and wife. I mean, I made them eat their spinach first, and the spinach is it's in the book. So this is my other side. This is the 30 years of making real food for family and friends. And we have a little family. There's the kid, who's now, yeah, I mean, look, at my age, I don't have a kid. He's 6'1", he's a grown-up, but you know, once you start calling a kid the kid, it's right. And there's my husband over there. So that's the little family. And when the kid was, oh, I don't know, he must have been, I don't know, about 14 or 15 years old. I took a look at him and I thought, he's a nice kid. You know? He's sweet, he's thoughtful, he's smart, he's so adorable. And we had such a nice relationship. And I thought, isn't this wonderful? A mother with a teenage son, and we get along. And I was just about to pat myself on the back, thinking, I didn't know a thing about child rearing, but I did an okay job. You had nothing to do with it, of course. When I heard on NPR, there was a report on NPR that said that my generation, the baby boomer generation, just seems to have remarkable relationships with their kids. I wasn't special. He's special, but I wasn't so special. It looked like everybody was just getting along with their kids these days. And it made me think back to when I was his age. And, I mean, I had a great mother. She never cooked, but she had other really, really good qualities. But we had our issues. And it was the time when, do you remember the expression, the generation gap? Yeah, that you know, never trust anyone over 30. Well, that really wasn't our problem, even though that was, you know, my era. Well, I really wasn't sure what it was that was making our relationship just ever so slightly not so smooth until I went to Paris. Michael and I went to Paris because I got married. I lived with my parents. I was born, I lived with my parents, I married Michael. I mean, that's kind of the progression of my life. So everything that I did first, I did with him. So we went to Paris for the first time together. And it was magical. Well, I was so young, I had no experience to really, you know, look back on. But I had never had the feeling of putting my feet down someplace and feeling that this was truly where I belonged, that I had a connection to this place. And now I'm a lot older, and I still have never had that feeling. I mean, I just felt like I was meant to be in Paris. And so I returned to Brooklyn, which was where I was born, and I told my mother that I loved her, and I told her that I had figured out what our problem was. We had a geographical gap. That as nice as she was, as good as she was, as great as she was, she had me in Brooklyn, right? When in fact, I know in her heart, right, I was meant to be born in Paris. And so I forgave her because, as I said, she was great and wonderful, but I spent the rest of my life making up for her poor judgment. So I wanted to be French. I just wanted to be French, or at least to look French. And so I traveled to France. Anytime we could put some money together, we got on a plane and we went to France. And sometimes when we could only put half the amount of money together, I went by myself. So I went back and forth to France, back and forth to France. I took French lessons. When Joshua was born, we had a French au pair. I mean, of course, right? We wouldn't have anybody from the neighborhood. And so, you know, I got really proficient. I know all the words for stroller and, you know, diaper. But I learned French. I learned to pout. Is anybody here French? We have any French? We have some French people. Well, men don't do this so much. We have a French woman?
Right here.
Ah, okay. You know the pout?
I'm from Normandy.
En fait, ça gêne.
Pardon?
You never pout in Normandy? People are so happy in Normandy, there's never a pout. You know, the pout that goes, you know, that, it's just a little, I don't know if you can see it back there, right? And it's usually accompanied by it's just a sound, You never do that? Oh, never in Normandy. Anybody over here? You, right? Yeah, so it's a, right? And it goes with a shrug. There's the French shrug. Do you shrug? A little shrug, right? There's the, you know, which, so it's like the, right? So that's the, and I practice that because, remember, I come from Brooklyn, so a shrug in Brooklyn is like, you know, it's the whole body. Instead of being accompanied by a, it's usually a, huh? I read Sartre and de Beauvoir, of course. I learned to drink espresso. I had never drunk espresso before. I learned to drink it really slowly because the idea was that I could order an espresso and sit in a cafe long enough to read an entire chapter of Sartre. You know, you really have to learn how to sit still. I tried to wear high heels. Didn't work. But I had this idea that to look French, you needed high heels. And if you couldn't wear high heels, then you had to wear the tightest leather pants you could find. Right? So I bought a pair of pants. I bought them at a shop called McDouglas, which still exists in Paris. And they were so tight. Okay. Michael claims I weighed 90 pounds when I bought them. But it took two salesmen, one on either side of me, who just kind of pushed like this on either side while I stood on my tiptoes to make myself thinner, right, and zipped. They were so uncomfortable. I can't even begin to tell you how uncomfortable they were. But I wore them. I wore them all the time without the high heels because those were truly uncomfortable. And so I pretended that I was French. And at some point I grew up and I realized that looking French really wasn't enough. That I probably, if I worked hard enough at it, could kind of pass every once in a while as a French person. But that what I really wanted was not the French look, but the French life. And I had been traveling back and forth to France enough to know that life in France is pretty good. That you agree, oh, okay, I'm getting a nod, right? No pout, but life in France is good. Mm-hmm. But for me, a French life was a food life. And while I cooked in America and I ate really well in France, what I wanted was to be able to eat well and cook in France, in my own French kitchen, for my own French friends. And I got to do that about, I was going to say 13 years ago, but now it's almost 14 years. When we got an apartment in Paris, in Saint-Germain-des-Prés, the cutest apartment you've ever seen. It was about the size of this, maybe two of these. But it was, you know, it was a romantic apartment. It was right in Saint-Germain-des-Prés, where if you looked out the window and you could see the steeple of the church and you could hear the bells, and it had beams and it had a fireplace. It didn't have an oven. In fact, it had a kitchen that was just the passway between the main room, the living room, dining room, and the bedroom. And it had one of these little kind of kitchenette things, a refrigerator like that, and two hot plates. And I cooked like mad in that apartment and washed the dishes in the bathtub because the sink was, you know, in a little kitchen like that. But it was fabulous for me because it really was, it had been my dream. I wanted to be able to cook in France. I wanted to be able to go to the markets and shop every day and get to know shopkeepers. It was kind of that vision of Peter Mayle and A Year in Provence without the carpenters. I wanted to get to know the people who were supplying my food. And it happened. happened. I got to know the wine guy, and he got to know that I prefer Syrah to Cabernet Sauvignon. And I got to know the cheese woman, and she got to know and forgive Michael for not liking goat cheese. It was very hard. She thought he was adorable until she discovered that he would not even taste a goat cheese. She came around. It took a little bit of time. The sausage lady, Madame Saucisson. So we had, right around the corner from our apartment was a market street, and there was a woman who had this narrow little charcuterie, and she had great sausage. And she knew that I liked a sausage from Laole that was not too hard, and not, like the Goldilocks, not too hard, not too soft. And it touched her that I had said to her that as soon as I got to Paris, because I would go, I'm there about 4 months of the year, but I'm there in little pieces. I'm never there for 4 months straight, which is kind of wonderful because it means I can go to the market all through the year and see things as they change. But she knew that on my first day in Paris, I would always come to her and I would get one of these sausages. And so when I would come down the street, I could already see her reaching over, right, and squeezing to get the one that was right for me. And actually, this was incredibly sweet. She didn't know my name. I knew her name was Michelle. She knew I came from New York, and she knew that I liked sausage from Laole. And after 9/11, I didn't go back to Paris until it was probably late October, I guess. And we got there on a Sunday, which is really, the markets are open until about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. It's really a busy day. And when I had gotten to her shop, there was a line, in the shop and out on the street. And just as I got to where, she's like every other French vendor, right? Focused, right? They look just at you, only at you. I used to think it was because they just cared so deeply about every customer. Some of it, I think, has to do with not looking at the person next to you, right, who's rolling her eyes and saying, when will it ever be my turn? But so Michelle was concentrating on her customer, and at some point she looked up and she saw me waiting in line, and she just took a deep breath and she started to cry, and she left the line and she came and she hugged me and she said, I was so worried about you. She said, I didn't know anything about you except that you lived in New York and you didn't come. You hadn't been here for a while, and I was really worried about you. Yeah. And I was so touched. I was just, who wouldn't have been? But it was these relationships that were formed just by shopping every day, by just talking to somebody and finding out, because you could never really get that little container of creme fraiche unless you chatted a little bit. And I loved that. But it actually wasn't all that easy for me. I arrived in Paris, I was going to say a woman of a certain age. I was a grown-up, right? And I'd been cooking, I'd been entertaining for years, I'd written a few cookbooks, but I still had a lot to learn. And, okay, wait. You can't be too careful. One of the things that I had to learn about was cheese. So, see this cheese platter? You're going, right? Right, it looks fabulous, doesn't it? Luscious. It's a minefield. It's an absolute minefield. As good as it looks, that's how many problems you can have with the cheese platter. Well, the problem is you have to know how to cut this cheese. So I was invited to a friend's house for dinner, and I was given the cheese platter first. So I just took tiny little pieces and because I really didn't know what to do with it. And afterwards I said to my friend, is there a special way to cut every cheese? And because I was watching how carefully everybody else was cutting. And she said, "Oh, you don't have to worry about it. You're American. Nobody expects anything from you." And she didn't mean to be nasty. What she meant was that I didn't grow up with this. This wasn't part of my culture. But cheese. You know the brie, that wonderful brie that usually you get in a wedge, right? All soft and creamy and runny. Well, you all may be Americans and you're forgiven everything. The one thing you'll never be forgiven is if you lop off that point, right? It's called the nose, right? Right? And brie comes from your part of the world. Yes, that's your cheese, right? Called the nose, cut it off. You'll never be invited to anybody's house again. Never. Right? A plain wedge of cheese like this, slice it like that. You might get an invitation, but not for the next week. So I bought a book. It's called L'art de couper le fromage. The art of cutting cheese, right? It's not too big, it's only about 60 pages, right? It's beautiful and scary. It looks like my high school geometry textbook, right? The cheeses are discussed by shape. There are drawings, right, kind of architectural, geometrical drawings, and then there are little dotted lines and arrows for how you should cut, and little like 60-degree marks and 40 degrees, and there's some cheeses I still don't eat in company, in polite company, because I haven't gotten that far in the book. I don't know how to cut them, and it was so my mistake. I had an experience because I was on book tour. We haven't been in Paris since we came back the beginning of September, and right before we came back to America, we had dinner at home. We had 10 people for dinner, and we had an American woman, a friend of ours. She had never been to Paris before. She'd never been to our home, and so therefore she was the guest of honor. And we had drinks we had champagne, and we had gougère, the first recipe in the book, and salmon rillette, also in that same chapter. And then we sat down at the table, and we had, I forgot what we had for first course. We had the tuna confit, and then we had the cheese course. So I come out of the kitchen, and I've got this nice big platter of cheese, gorgeous. And I walk directly to her, and while I'm just about at her place, and I'm about to put it down so that she can be the first to serve, I think, actually what I think is oi. I think I've made a mistake. Well, she's the guest of honor. Giving her the cheese platter first is not doing her a favor. And sure enough, what she did to that. Okay, so of course the first thing she did was the nose off the brie, right? She passed the platter. I looked at it. She loved cheese, so she touched, like she kind of cut it. She passed it to the guy to her left, I guess, yeah. And this is the guy you should invite. He should be in the UN. He took one look at the cheese platter, knew there was a problem, and just engaged everybody at the table in lively conversation and re-sculpted each of the cheeses, right? So that when they were passed, no one ever knew what she had done. Yeah. But, it's not just the cutting the cheese. Let me read you. It's so rare that a cookbook author gets to read from her book. Right? I have to look at the index, sorry. I don't know where it is. As I say, it's not just cutting the cheese, it's actually shopping for the cheese that's a lesson. It's under C. Page 37. I was very close. So if you'd like to read along, we could do this responsively if you'd like. It's on page 37. It's called Complaining the French Way. Shortly after we'd moved into our first Paris apartment, I went shopping in one of the city's most esteemed cheese shops. It's very narrow, with barely enough room for the sale, I mean really narrow, with barely enough room for the salespeople and a couple of customers to maneuver. It's not an easy place for a beginner because the lines are long, and when it's your turn, it's not just the person behind you, but the salesperson as well, who wants you to be snappy about making your choices. One day I was having 6 people for dinner and I needed some help choosing an assortment for my cheese platter. I asked for quelques conseils, some advice, and made it as clear as I could that I wanted everything to be absolutely perfect, meaning the cheese had to be at its prime, no leaving it under a dome for a day or two or microwaving it to age it. It's done. It turned out to be my lucky day. The saleswoman was patient, and after discussing each cheese and giving me a taste of those I didn't know, she handed me my purchases and wished me une très bonne soirée. And the evening really was very good, and the cheese was terrific. Everything except the brie, which was just shy of ready and probably would have benefited from a quick spin in the microwave if only I'd had the nerve. The next day, with 4 more friends expected for dinner, we do a lot of dinners in Paris. A lot. Okay, I'll keep reading, but remind me to tell you about dinners in Paris and dinners in New York. Will you be in charge? Okay. The next day, with 4 more friends expected for dinner, I was back in line for cheese, and as it happened, I ended up with the same saleswoman. She greeted me warmly. Show up twice to the same place and you're almost a regular. And she asked how my dinner had gone. I told her everything was great. And then I sheepishly mentioned that the brie wasn't as creamy as I thought it should have been, that it was white at its heart. You'd have thought I'd told her she was responsible for the collapse of the Eiffel Tower. Such regret, such desolation, such profound sadness. Yeah, the French can be charmingly overdramatic. This was a little overwhelming for me, since I'm the kind of person who thinks that when I get home from the market and find that the milk's sour, it's my fault. But it seems that diffidently mumbled disappointment conformed to the rules. And after all the apologies, the saleswoman helped me choose a new assortment, then declared, "Tonight's cheese will be impeccable." And so it was. Having caused a fuss, I thought it was only right to return to compliment her on her choices. So there I was, in line for the 3rd time in as many days. When I hit the front of the queue, it was a gentleman salesperson who started to offer his services. However, after seeing me, he stopped his standard "how may I help you" greeting and said, "Ah, you're the American who's Janine's customer. Un instant, I'll get her." Now, after 3 days, I wasn't just a regular. I was someone with my own personal cheese coach. And why? Because I'd complained. Months later, I checked with Janine to make sure I had it right. Yes, it was because I'd complained. Nicely. By doing this, I scored a point for Americans, assured myself a steady supply of the finest cheeses, and learned something important about cultural differences. In America, if you complain, you're a crank. In France, you're a connoisseur. Thank you. Wait, this is so out of order, but I want to tell you because I had this epiphany, and saying that we have people for dinner made me think of it. I had this epiphany a couple of weeks ago. I was thinking about how, well, okay, let me see. How many of you entertain regularly at home? This is a big group, and Rosanna's got her hand up. And this is the most number of people who have said this. I can't remember, and I cook a lot, surprise. I can't remember the last time I had people home for dinner, at a dinner party at our house in New York, our apartment. I do a lot of dinners in Connecticut. I can't remember we live in Westbrook. I can't remember the last time we were invited to anyone's home in New York for dinner. And in Connecticut, in Westbrook, we make dinners, our friends make dinners. And in Paris, we cook all the time, and people are always in the apartment, and we're always invited out. And I had this thought a couple of weeks ago about the difference between having friends for dinner in America and having them for dinner in France. In America, when we talk about, that was me again. In America, when we talk about having people come to our homes for dinner, we say we're having a dinner party, right? In France, if you're translating it to English, you say come home for dinner, right?
Yeah.
The difference between come for a dinner party and come home for dinner, it's the difference between renovating your kitchen before you can have people come. It's the difference between having to fluff everything up and get out your best silver and think about what your menu is going to be and make sure it's either, elaborate or complicated or a project or something that shows that you've worked all weekend, versus come home. We'll have quiche and a salad, but we'll be together. And it just struck me a couple of weeks ago, and I thought it was such an interesting, maybe you don't find it as fascinating as I do, but I just thought it was really interesting, that difference. It's a difference in language, but I think it translates to a real difference in how we feel about having people around us cooking, for people. And now, after that digression, I finally did learn how to complain, how to shop, how to cook with French flour, bake with French flour. It's really not all that easy. The flour is very fine, and everything comes out differently. It's lighter than our flour. But I had been, as I said, it's been 30 years going back and forth, and now almost 14 years that we've had an apartment and that we could have people come home for dinner. And so I was thrilled to get the chance to write this book, because this book was kind of like my baking book, which I thought of as a book of my 3 decades of experience. That's what this book is like. And this book it's got a mix of recipes. So it has recipes that are all mine, things that I make all the time when I'm in France, and actually things that I make all the time when I'm in New York and Connecticut, because this is just the way I cook. So they're my recipes. Then there are the recipes from my friends. And I did a really good job choosing my friends when we got to Paris. They're all good cooks. They're just great cooks. And those who aren't fabulous cooks really know wine. And they all love to eat. I mean, so it's perfect. So I have, for instance, my friend Martine, who was the one who clued me in on how to cut cheese. Martine's roasted peppers, the easiest dish in the world. And I was also thinking about this. Here, if you see a plate of roast peppers, it's part of an antipasto or it's part of a buffet. It's never its own dish. And in France, that's a first course. Beautifully roasted peppers, olive oil, some salt, some cracked pepper, maybe some herbs, all by itself on a plate with a lot of bread so that you can sop up the juices afterwards. And it's really beautiful and simple. So I have Martine's peppers. I have my friend Hélène's hamburger. I had to go to France to get a fabulous hamburger. It's got cornichon peppers, cornichon capers, and sun-dried tomatoes in the patty. It's fabulous. Her sister's pumpkin, which I talked about this on All Things Considered. I made this with Michel Norris, who's the host of All Things Considered, and I'm going to be making it. I've made it tons, but I'm going to make it for Thanksgiving. Elaine's friend Catherine lives in Lyon, and her husband has a kind of recreational farm outside of the city, and he grows pumpkins. And every year, just as the pumpkins are starting to grow, the kids go out to the farm and they carve their names in the pumpkins. And then when the pumpkins grow, the kids' names grow as well. So it's kind of like having your personalized monogram pumpkin. And then they each get to have this stuffed pumpkin. And so when Catherine sent me the recipe, she said, it's not really a recipe, and I'm sure you'll do something else to it. And in fact, I finally had to decide on calling it a recipe and pinning it down and putting it in the book, but I never make it the same way twice. So it's a pumpkin that you hollow out and you fill with bread, cubes of bread, stale bread, and I put bacon in it and cheese and herbs and garlic and cream, and then you just bake it. And you can either cut it so you have a slice of pumpkin with this wonderful creamy, cheesy, soft, yummy filling on top, or you can scoop in and mush the whole thing around and serve it well, almost like mashed potatoes, except it's mashed pumpkin and all this good stuff. And you can do it with rice instead of bread. You can do it with spinach, with chard. Somebody wrote to me and said they made it as she made it as a sweet, almost as a bread pudding. So she put challah or brioche in it, apples, nuts, cinnamon, cream right in there, and then the pumpkin to go with it. Great idea. My friend Mary Lynn's apple cake, and that's, okay, I'm going to tell you what you're going to have, because it's easier than telling you what's in the book. So these are you can all hear me, yes? The coconut friand. So a friand is a little sweet, something that you might have after dessert, just as a little nibble. And these are, actually they're related to, it's totally white. It doesn't have yolks, it has egg whites in it. And it's a very light, spongy kind of sweet. And it's related to the visitandine, which is made as a cake. And they're both slightly dense and beautifully white. And visitandine is an order of nuns. And the thought is that the cake may have been a cake that the nuns made. I searched and searched and searched. I asked a million questions. That's as much information as I have. Okay. Actually, this recipe for the coconut friand was given to me by Nick Malgeri. Does anybody know Nick? Yeah, if you're a baker, you might. He's written several cookbooks. Nick worked in Monte Carlo for many years as a pastry chef, and this recipe came from his time there. And then we have speculoos, which are spice cookies. I can't believe you all baked this. Thank you. Just wait till you see them. They're so beautiful. Speculoos are spice cookies made just about this time and through the holidays. And sadly, there's a mistake in the recipe, and you'll have a piece of paper in the book. The egg. It never quite made it into print. And the author says, you'll have this wonderful, soft, malleable dough without the egg yolk crumbs. So, but it's fixed. And you can go, I have a website, DorieGreenspan.com, and the proper recipe is there. And then mustard bâton. So my friend Elaine of hamburger fame said, you've got to make this recipe. She had it at a friend's house. It's puff pastry. You roll it out. You put mustard on half of it. You fold the other half of the puff pastry over, and then you cut it. I said, I don't think that's a recipe. She said, you're missing something, and I didn't do it, and I didn't do it. And one night, she came over to my apartment with puff pastry and mustard, and she said, we're making these tonight, and they were so great. It's a recipe. It's a recipe. Guacamole and tzatziki. So guacamole, you know, tzatziki is a Greek cucumber and yogurt mix. And I know it doesn't sound French to you, but in fact, this is like French fast food. That you can go into any supermarket and you'll see containers of guacamole and containers of tzatziki. It's just, and usually the tzatziki is right next to the tarama, the cod roe that you would put on blini. So that was really the fun of doing this book. I worked with Julia Child. I actually got to live with her the summer that we filmed Baking with Julia. And I adore mastering the art of French cooking. And it's really what most of us think of as French food because Julia gave it to us. And it's still an extraordinary look. But that food is old. Julia wrote, the book was published in the 60s. Julia did the research in the 50s and in the 40s. So we're talking about food that was not brand new food when she wrote about it, but food that she researched 60 and 70 years ago. And that food still exists in France. And I love it and I'm glad it's there. But there's also new food. And for me, what was so exciting was to get these recipes from my friends, to get a recipe from my friend who's the chef at Le Comptoir in Canterbury, great restaurant. He gave me a recipe for tuna pizza. So it's puff pastry. I made it with him in his kitchen. And I said, did you make that puff pastry? He said, no, I bought it in the store. Where did you get yours? Yeah, I bought it in the store too. So it's store-bought puff pastry that's rolled out and baked between two baking sheets, so it never really gets to puff. And then on it are sauteed onions, raw tuna, mozzarella, tomatoes, black olives, radishes, and ginger. It's fabulous. It goes back in the oven for a couple of minutes just to warm it. And I think about this dish and I think if I were to give it to you, would your first response be, oh, goody, French food? No, but this is really what's so exciting about what's happening in French food today. I digress. Mary-Elaine's apple cake, which is turning out to be probably the most popular recipe in the book, if you can judge by the number of bloggers who've made it. And where's my French Fridays with Dory person? There you are. There's a group called FrenchFridaysWithDory.com. I didn't start it. Erica said that I did, but I didn't. It was started by the same person who started Tuesdays with Dory. And it's a cook-along club. And every week people cook one recipe from the book and post a picture of it either to that website or to a Flickr account or to their own blogs. And so as part of the November menu, this was one of the recipes. And this comes from my editor. I write the food section of the Louis Vuitton Guide to New York City. And Mary Elaine's my editor. And so that's her recipe. Undercover here are financiers. Financiers are also, they were created in Paris in the 1800s by a pastry chef who had, I love this story, pastry chef who had a shop right near the stock exchange. And every day, late in the afternoon, the stockbrokers, the financiers, would come running into his shop, grab something to eat, and run out again. I mean, evidently, as busy then as stockbrokers are now. And he wanted to make something for them that would be easy. So it's like, this is like the original fast food. He wanted something that they wouldn't need a knife, a fork, or a spoon for, and something that they could eat that wouldn't get crumbs on their ties. And so he made this little sweet, and he named it for them. But it's also, it has, maybe I should tell, well, I'll tell you now. It has so much butter. It has so much butter, like almost an unconscionable amount of butter. And so you can say that the sweet is as rich as the financier. Okay. The savory cheese and chive bread. Often when you come to someone's home and you'll have champagne or white wine before dinner, you'll have a dry, it's actually called a cake. Anything that's baked in a loaf pan in French is a cake. And so this is a savory cake, a cake salé. And it's great with wine. And there's another one over here, the back of the card, cheese and olive bread. I was with Patricia Wells, another cookbook author. She and I were in Provence together and we were shopping. We went into the cheese shop, gorgeous cheese shop in Maison de Romaine where she lives. And they had a recipe card, and so we both grabbed it. And this is the recipe that's on the back of the card. And then we have, what? Oh, the Dieter's Tartine. There's a fabulous, fabulous bread shop in Paris, Poilane, Poilane. He makes a bread, well, he's no longer alive, but his daughter runs the bakery, and he makes a bread called a miche. It's round, it's about, I've forgotten whether it's about 15 inches across, and it weighs 5 pounds. And right next door to the bakery, it's a heavy kind of rustic bread. And right next door to the bakery, they have a little, it's called cuisine de bar, and it serves just tartine, which are open-faced sandwiches. And this is the one that the ladies who shop have, because it's the bakery is right near Yves Saint Laurent, Prada. It's a very, very chic area. And so this is the favorite of the people in the shopping area because it has fromage blanc, 0% fat on it, cucumbers and tomatoes. And you can make it with cottage cheese if you really whip it up, and just a little non-fat cottage cheese, and just a little bit of non-fat sour cream. Okay, and then we have the sablé, so vanilla and chocolate, and sablé means sandy. And I still can't believe that we have all of this. So sablé are cookies. They're like shortbread cookies. It's the French version of shortbread cookies, and what makes them great is the butter. Yeah. And so I'm not going to talk about the book because you get to eat the book. Right? So instead, I will just thank you all for coming and thank. Who are the bakers here? Would you stand up? Who are our bakers? Thank you so much. Do we have time for a couple of questions? I talked longer than I thought I was going to, but
Yeah.
wait.
I'm Lorette. You must tell me how to cut the brie.
Oh, I'm sorry. How to cut the brie? Okay, so I'm sorry. Oh, that was terrible. Right. Okay. So here's the brie. How do we do the brie? All right. Okay. It should be like this, of course, right? Okay. Don't cut the nose, right? You cut. Right? Because the reason okay, so the bottom line on cutting cheese, and if you can figure out all of this, let me know. By the time the cheese platter gets to the last person, each piece of cheese should look like a miniature version of what it started out to be. Okay? So you want, I'm so glad you asked, thank you. So you want to cut the cheese so that it just gets smaller and smaller but remains its perfect size. And the reason you don't cut the nose off is not just because it's considered ugly and it doesn't conform to that miniaturization process. It's also because it's the best part of the brie. Yeah, so if you take it for yourself, you're just one selfish person. You're welcome.
Does that mean a round piece of cheese? You just go around the edges?
No, a round piece of cheese you cut in wedges. You cut in wedges so that once again everybody gets something from the center. Right? Yes?
What's the phrase for come home for dinner as opposed to dinner party? Say in French,
To say come home for dinner, I think you would just say venez chez moi pour dîner. You know, right? Ou viens la maison.
Venez à la maison, venez à la maison, ou venez chez moi.
Oui, venez chez moi, come to my house. Venez à la maison. Right?
Come to my house.
Right? So it's come to my house. Yes.
Can you tell us about Julia Child? And of course, it was over half a century ago. What she was doing in French cuisine now, because of all the immigrants in France, and you're talking about the Greek and the guacamole. How has that influx of immigrants? As France is not just the French.
No.
Now,
Did you
how
hear
does
that
it
question?
change the cuisine?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because, of course, France always had, or for many, many years, and certainly even when Julia was in France, there were people from North Africa who had their own cuisine. There were people who had come from Eastern Europe during the war who ended up staying in France. But Julia's French cuisine was pure French. It was the cuisine really of Escoffier. Somebody said to me it was restaurant cuisine, and I don't really feel that way about it. But actually there's a fabulous book. Maybe you can put your name on the waiting list at the library for it. I think it's just out, and if it's not just out, it's just coming out. And it's called As Always, Julia. And it's the correspondence between Julia Child and Avis Devoto, who really helped her bring the book to publication. And I was so sad to finish it because these are two delightful, intelligent, curious about the world women who really like one another, and they were pen pals for years. And it's a fabulous book. But anyway, Julia was researching this food at a time when it was really, there wasn't so much of an acceptance, I think, of the cuisine of immigrants. But now the world is completely different. It's the globalization, but I don't say it negatively. I mean, the fact that people are traveling more, that chefs are traveling more, that exotic ingredients are available, and that there's an audience for new food. There's a food network in France. The French food magazines are so gorgeous. They're fabulously beautiful. And they're, like every magazine that comes out every month, they're looking for new things. And so people are being stretched and they're getting excited about doing new food.
The other thing is that 25 years ago, when Dory was looking for a pastry job, she interviewed with a French pastry chef who desperately needed someone to work with him. And the interview was carried on all in French, and he kept saying, "Le garçon."
I'm looking for a boy. He kept saying, I'm looking for a boy.
And Dory finally said to him, "I'm not a boy." He said, "Yes, and you will not be my pastry chef. Maybe you can go work for a Swiss, okay?" Today, you would find, actually the other person was pastry of Belgium.
Right.
But today, if you went into a French restaurant kitchen, you'll find women, you'll find a lot of non-French people who are there to learn, but also flipping that around, ginger in Eve's.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that Yves Kandebour put ginger with his tuna and cheese, there's a lot of playfulness, there's a lot of stretching, and yet there's this solid base, and the traditional dishes are still adored. I made dinner for, actually for I guess Mary Lynn was there, for Mary Lynn of Apple Cake fame, and Pierre Hermé, the pastry chef, and we were a bunch of people around the table, and I didn't know what I was going to make. And I ended up making hachis parmentier, the recipe's in the book, and it's essentially shepherd's pie. So it's chopped beef with vegetables, if I had, it's traditionally made with leftovers, and then mashed potatoes on top and cheese. You can't get a more kind of homey, comforting, mother's trying to save some money kind of dish. And I served it to this very sophisticated group of people who loved it, who absolutely loved it, because it brought back so many memories, and because it's not a dish that they have any longer, but it was so recognizable to them, and happily recognizable. So that food, I love that everything exists together. It's they haven't gone to molecular gastronomy and thrown everything out. It's all there. It's all there. Yes?
What did you serve Pierre for dessert?
Oh, what did I serve Pierre for dessert? I never serve Pierre dessert. Just Pierre brings his own. Yeah. Whenever I invite him for dinner, he always says, "I'll take care of dessert."
Do you haul French flour back to the States, and what do you take
going the other way.
Do I haul French flour back to the States, and what do I take the other way? I never bring French flour back. I always bring American flour there. I cook like mad when I'm in France, but I don't ever test a recipe there. So I'll create something new, I'll collect recipes, I'll cook for friends and for us, but everything has to be tested here with American ingredients.